Hello, and welcome to a special episode, actually a whole special month, of Gaming with Soul, seeking soul through the lens of pop culture and gaming. So this week we have decided, or this month we have decided to do the spookier Halloween-y kind of things, and we are starting with vampires.
Yes, I had an idea or this inspiration last month that on Halloween I wanted to do the witch. And
Yep.
I asked Jamie if we could cover the witch, and Jamie's like, there, let's do a whole month. So I'm like,
Yep.
yes, this is going to be fun. So yeah,
Yes.
because of course, as a witch, this month is our month.
Yep.
This is the month that we love to play. It's literally, this is the month we're allowed to be ourselves and nobody gives us a second thought. So the Halloween month, the lead up to Halloween, let's do the spooky stuff.
And yes, as she kind of briefly mentioned, we are planning to release a bonus episode on Halloween, specifically on the witch.
Yes, yay! Okay, I'll settle down now.
Yeah, you know what I forgot to do?
What'd you forget to do?
Sorry, this is a tangent. I forgot to try to get Straw to dance again. I just realized it. It just hit me that I completely spaced getting Straw to dance again. We finished that campaign this week.
Were you happy with how that all wrapped up?
I am a bit. I know it felt like I was rushing it at the end, but I was playing Rex like Rex would have been played, which is he's kind of just tired of everyone's bullshit and wants to end it.
I was also sort of trying. I had a couple of other things I could have done at the end, but it was getting so late that I really needed to wrap it up too. But yeah, it was
Speaking
probably
of vampires,
one of the happily ever afters. But yes, we killed Strahd and freed Barovia and stopped the evil from ever coming back. So yay!
Yes, we stopped the evil from ever coming back because when the campaign was over and everybody's like, "Yay, we're done, we can go home," Rex went, "No, I still have work to do," and went and destroyed all the evil sarcophaguses in the basement.
Hey, you had to go back. You had to take Jeffrey back to Exavanta anyway.
Fair enough, but yeah.
But yes, vampires. How better to start a Halloween month, considering we have just finished a Halloween or a vampire-inspired campaign, than to talk vampire. Look, I've been doing a bit of research as a teen who grew up in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s. I was a teenager when vampires became this massive romantic icon. The years of Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman and Winona Ryder really romanticized it all. We had Interview with the Vampire, of course, with Brad Pitt.
I was way too young to have seen that movie when I seen that movie.
That it was the rebirth of vampire as truly a romantic icon rather than the demoness villain that they had always been before.
Which, to me, like somebody once said that the reason vampires are so romanticized is because sucking blood is such an intimate thing.
That is an element of it. That is an element of it. There's several aspects as to why vampires are romanticized. Yes, it sounds gross, but anytime that there is fluid sharing, sharing of some aspect of bodily fluid, there is an intimate. There's also the whole "they need me to survive" kind of deal. Now, this is where a lot of the old things of vampire was, if you got bitten by a vampire, you would die and turn into one. Whereas a lot of the newer storylines it's more scientific, is a vampire couldn't drink an entire human dry in one sitting. So it ended up being more an act of intimacy.
Yeah.
And ended up sexualizing that. The other reasons we tended to love vampires, firstly, the whole immortality shtick appeals to a lot of people. But the real reason actually comes from the simple fact that they have become portrayed as these very solitary, tormented souls.
Yeah.
And this really appeals to teenagers.
Fair.
This is why the majority of vampire, especially television and movies, is geared towards teens. And we're talking mid to late teens. even the tweens, the older tweens, as the pubescent juices start to flow, this is
Don't
geared
ever say
towards them.
pubescent juices again, please.
Sorry, that's just how it came out. But this is terrible, isn't it? And I've got a teenager. That's just wrong.
Yeah,
Anyway.
a little bit.
But yeah, it's, I mean, vampires are emos.
Yeah.
For all intents and purposes. The way vampires had been, or had kind of come about, they were dark, they were tortured, they wanted redemption, but kind of were angry and pissed at the whole world at the same time. They needed that love, intimacy, often were looking for their true love or someone to share their eternity with. It's really appealing to a teen.
Yeah. And then you look at Vampire the Masquerade and a clan like Bruja. We'll get into it a little more later, but a clan like Bruja, and you go, where's the sex appeal here?
But yeah, let's go. Sorry, but yeah, we'll get into the gaming archaeology because we kind of skipped ahead. I really wanted to start with, not a lot of people are aware of the history of vampire, of what or where the legends originated from, and it's actually really interesting.
Yep,
because
I've heard a story once that was the origin of vampires, but I want to hear what you have to say because I'm curious at your take on what it was.
Okay. The simple fact is before the 1700s, the term vampire did not exist.
Yeah.
Vampires in the form that we know them now have only actually been around since the 1800s.
That makes sense.
Before that, ironically, they were either vengeful spirits or demons.
Huh.
And when you look to throughout history, almost every indigenous culture has some kind of vampiric demon in it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, if we look from historical, literary, one of the very first ones that comes up tends to be Lilith. She was demonized. Again, a lot of the very first ones were all female too.
Yeah.
These female demonics, and the whole thing is they fed off their prey.
Well, you know where that comes from, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the
took everything from me. She's a blood-sucking bastard.
Actually, it was not so much that, because of course in those days divorce didn't happen because you usually died.
Yeah, that's true.
You were lucky if you and your partner lived to be 40. So there was none of this, growing old together. You were really lucky if that happened. If you grew old.
Together, yes, I would already be growing old with my wife at this point.
Exactly. Oh God, my husband and I, after 30 years, we would be legendary in our community to have survived this long, been married this long, that sort of deal. So a lot of the time, these female demons in the early days were actually to scare men to get married.
Yeah, that's fair.
The legends and the things said that if you don't get married, Lilith will, and you sleep alone, Lilith will come to you during the night and she will consume you. Or one of the succubus will come to the night, or one of the other female demons will come and consume you. Some were also geared towards women too, to scare them into behavior.
Incubus.
The incubus was one of them. There's a really interesting one in I think either Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, somewhere like that. It was called the Mananagal or something along those lines. Forgive me for butchering it. It was like a demonic female. It could separate its torso from the base of its body, sprout wings, would fly around and attack pregnant women, and its long tongue would pull out the heart of their unborn child. It was they needed to be escorted everywhere, needed to make sure that there was someone there to protect them. It was to scare them into obedience.
The quote unquote good old days.
Before that, the undead form that kind of precurses how vampire rose. The revenants, of course, in Western Europe. The Draga, or how would you pronounce that in the Norse? Is it the Drago?
The Draugr.
Draugr.
Or Durgar.
Thank you. I can't do that with my tongue. Um,
Dulgar.
they are classified. I mean, yes, they are an undead and vengeful spirit typically, but there
Yeah,
are
a lot of
elements
times
that
they're
make them
showed more like
vampiric as
zombies.
well. Yeah,
Fair.
but there are ties into, again, revenants, because a
Mhm.
lot of the typical aspects of how vampire iconology rose came from revenant first. Now, the whole reason the vampire legends in their more modern forms took root in Eastern Europe. And there were a series of things that happened in Eastern Europe that kind of bore the rise of these legends. And we literally see it starting to spread out from places like Romania, Hungary, again, this Eastern European bloc. Now, although he was later tied to vampirism, the very, very famous Vlad Dracul, or he
Yep.
was actually Vlad Tepes, known
Vlad
very
the
well as
Impaler.
Vlad the Impaler. There are legends and things that said that he drank the blood of his enemies. Now, whether or not he actually did was never really documented. It was more that he was this ferocious protector of his people. Now, he is a Romanian hero. He is a
Mhm.
legendary hero of the people, and he was dragged into this because of the correlation through Bram Stoker's
Yep.
Dracula. Bram Stoker wrote him in as kind of this iconic, anti-hero because of everything that he'd done, and then he lost his woman and blah, blah, blah. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But there was no real historical proof that he actually drank the blood of his enemies, only that he was bloodthirsty. He was, he was not afraid to impale his enemies, leave them up on spikes to instill fear into others. But whether he was actually a vampire, very, very unlikely. There's no real connection to symbolism and mythology with him. Many of us have heard the name of Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Now,
Yeah.
she was a very, very crazy lady who lived in Hungary in the late
Yeah.
1500s and early 1600s. She was a countess and a noblewoman, and is written into the Guinness Book of World Records as the female serial killer with the highest body count.
Mhm.
Now, it is strongly argued as to how many she actually killed. It's from anything from like 120 to 650 women, and this is in a 20-year period, basically from 1590 to 1610. Now, she was known and noted and tried, convicted, and imprisoned for torturing and killing all these women. Why is still up for debate, because although it has been very, very well noted that she supposedly bathed in the blood of these women, that was
Yeah.
actually something that was revealed later.
Mhm.
That sort of came up well after, I think, either after the trial, years and years after her trials, or years after her death. And whether or not it was actually true, nobody can verify. It is entirely possible. I mean, that many dead people, it's entirely possible that that is what she did. But it's not something that can actually be verified. So it's one of those, it's legend now, what she did with them. But it was supposedly all part of her process to remain youthful.
Yeah. She did a lot of crazy things to try to remain youthful.
Yeah, and again, there's so much that's there for her. If you really want to creep yourself out and read up on a really hardcore crazy lady, yeah, Elizabeth Bathory, she was insane, absolute insane. But one of the most interesting vampire stories actually came up in around 1672. Now, this one's quite well documented and was kind of validated by this entire village. Now, the story goes there was this man, forgive me, I cannot remember his name. He apparently died and
Mhm.
then basically would come to people's houses afterwards, would knock on their door, and then within a few days of knocking on their door, someone in that household would die. Now, apparently, he did this for 16 years. Got out of his
Jeez.
grave, went around, would knock on somebody's door. Within a few days, somebody at that house would die. And eventually the town priest and everybody kind of gathered people together. They opened up his coffin. They found him really well preserved. Apparently had blood around his mouth, sort of, a little bit bloated and ruddy and all that sort of thing. So they then proceeded to, cut off his head, drive a stake through him, do the usual, let's kill the vampire kind of deal. But this one was one of those stories that was validated by many, it was validated by the whole town that this guy apparently was dead. And for 16 years, he randomly would appear, would knock at somebody's door, and then someone would die.
It's good to know it took them 16 years to effing do something about it.
Awesome,
that's just Jerry. That's just Jerry.
Yeah.
He goes around taking children, killing them, taking adults, killing them, whatever. 16 years later, the priest is like, I should probably get on this Jerry case. It's been sitting on my desk for
it probably would have been somebody important had finally somebody important finally had died to this. So it's like,
Jerry crossed the line.
It's like, now we need to do something about this. But interestingly, there is some belief that the whole staking element of vampires came from this. Because this is also around the time where in Romania, the strigoi, which is the very, very common idea of what vampire was before. The strigoi were vengeful spirits of somebody who had passed over that would sort of come back and needed to feed on the living to survive and wreak terror. They flew on bat-like wings. There were very, very many vampire-esque aspects about the strigoi. When this guy in Croatia, this story started to spread through Europe. And this was also this was towards the end of the witch burning years, because the witch burning kind of started to fizzle out towards in the 1700s. So this was like when the witch burning was kind of really insane. And these stories started coming up. And so they started seeing, they'd find people who had passed away with strange marks on their bodies. Now, some viruses, not smallpox, obviously, but plagues and things, the blotches can make it look like they were bitten or had wounds that looked like they were bitten by something. And so there started up this trend to start digging up bodies to see whether or not the people were getting out of their coffins to go out and kill people. The whole thing is when they would open up the coffin, and especially if the bodies hadn't deteriorated either because it was cold or they had preserved reasonably well, what these people would note as what we know to be the natural processes of death and decomposition. Science has shown us that after the body dies, because of dehydration, the skin and everything starts to contract. It makes it look like the hair's growing. It looks like the fingernails are growing. Gases build up in the abdomen, that distends and it pushes out fluids from the corner of your mouth. So it looks like this blood and stuff coming up through your mouth. This is all natural decomposition procedures. In the 1600s and 1700s, they had no clue.
They're like, we just put it in the ground and come back later and it's dirt and a skeleton. We don't know what's happening.
Or worse, they open it up and there is a reasonably well intact body there, but its hair is longer and its fingernails are longer and its stomach is bloated and there's blood in the corner of its mouth. Oh my God, this guy has gotten up and has been running around eating people. So
I'm resisting the urge.
So the whole idea, and this is an interesting thing that came up, this whole thing of staking a vampire through the heart with a wooden stake actually had nothing to do with this will kill the vampire. It was more this whole staking them to their coffin was to stop them from getting up and running around. So you would drive the stakes into the vampire or the supposed vampire to stop them from getting out of their coffin.
Yeah.
There were a lot of procedures about, yes, you could decapitate. There was cutting out the heart and cutting it in half, was burning it, scattering the ashes in bodies of water, all sorts of different things to make sure the vampire would stay dead. But one of the very simple things they did to prevent people from turning into a vampire was to bury them upside down. So it's like basically bury them so they were facing down. So if they started digging, they'll just dig straight to hell.
Yay. Yeah. The original story I heard was, and this is probably part of the larger stories you've been telling. They used to have a coffin with a pedal at the bottom, and it was tied to a string that led to a bell above ground.
Okay.
And so the idea was, if you were buried alive, because that happened back then a lot, somebody would fall asleep and they wouldn't check it, and then they'd be like, "Oh, he's dead, bury him," and then they'd find out later, no, he just kind of passed out for a while.
Well, they were they were feverish and in
Yep.
in those sort of semi-coma type deals. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a particular person, and I forget the name, but he was a count of some sort, who they buried him in one of these things because, of course, only the wealthy could afford them anyway. And the bell kept ringing. So they'd unbury him and he'd still be dead. And then they'd bury him again and the bell would start ringing. My guess is it was a windy day. And so they'd unbury him and, he was dead the whole time. So they thought, he was some kind of undead vampire. And I've heard that's the part of the inspiration for like Bram Stoker's Dracula and stuff like that.
The whole thing is Bram Stoker's Dracula, and there was actually a book before Bram Stoker's Dracula that kind of hit and really started this new idea of vampire. Bram Stoker kind of was the quintessential, and now is like the basis of all modern day vampire lore. But before that, there was actually another book by an author by the name of John William Polidori, and it was called The Vampire. And that was written in 1819, so about 80 years before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, wrote actual Dracula. And The Vampire, I mean, I haven't read this book. I've actually only recently discovered of its existence, but the original story was this vampire was made to be a creature you felt sorry for.
Yeah.
It was the first stopping it from being this true revenant monster into being a character and a creature that was understandable and relatable. There were supposedly a couple of other books through the 1800s that had vampire aspects in it. But yeah, Bram Stoker's was the quintessential that really changed what vampire lore was. And his lore was from a collection of lore. It wasn't he didn't just follow one story. He looked into all the legends of a particular region, and it was around Transylvania, into their regional lore around vampire and their legends and such attached to that. And that's what he based his story on. And of course, since he has done that, he has made Transylvania a tourist destination. Everyone wants to go where the vampires supposedly come from. And the superstition, because let's face it, Eastern Europe, a lot of superstition. Lots and lots and lots of superstition. I mean, it's a superstitious type environment with religion and old world cultures all kind of blended together. So there's a lot of these natural superstitious aspects.
So the Chinese hopping vampires are interesting because they're originally just hungry ghosts. They're basically a corpse that has been in the grave so long it becomes stiff or hard, and when it rises up, it can't bend any of its limbs. So that's why they just have their arms stuck out going for you, and they hop because they can't move. Apparently, they also usually have a paper talisman attached to their head, a warding talisman, which is kind of funny too. But the whole them becoming vampire things is actually more modern time because they took inspiration from Western vampires. So yeah, I just found that interesting. And they were created by things like supernatural arts resurrecting the dead, spirits possessing a dead body, a corpse absorbing sufficient yang kuai, I don't know what that is, to return to life. Things like that.
I think it's a type of life force. But most precursor to vampire lore is some sort of regional restless or vengeful spirit or demon.
But the ones I wanted to talk about when I read them, because you mentioned earlier talking about a lot of the time it's a warning for a woman to to get married or be faithful, or a man to get married and be faithful. That's very much the origin of the Japanese vampires.
Okay.
Because it was, and I'll read a little bit of what I pulled up here. I'm going to paraphrase because I don't want to steal directly. They had two different kinds. They have the Rokuro Kubi. I cannot speak Japanese.
Rokuro Kubi.
Yep. And the Nuka Kubi. Nuka Kubi. It almost sounds like a Fallout reference. The first one, the Rakuru one, is pulling the long-necked vampire. And it's women when they're asleep, usually women. Sometimes it's men, but generally it's women, according to what I was reading. They become these after committing a sin or being unfaithful to their husband. And it's literally while they're asleep, their neck stretches out so they can find victims to bite and drink their blood.
Yay.
Their body doesn't move. Their head, neck just stretch way out, and they attack people.
Awesome.
And sometimes it's vengeance, because there was a story about a monk who he killed a woman for her husband because she had gotten really sick and the husband couldn't afford to take care of her. So the monk showed up and killed her. He was like a monk who had stepped away from the priesthood. And then one day he went to a different inn, and he's like, the innkeeper's daughter's really hot. I want to do her. And when she fell asleep after they lay together, her neck stretched out and her face changed into the woman he killed earlier.
Yeah.
And attacked her, and attacked him. Angrily berated him is what it says in the story. So yelled at him, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then the next morning he found out the innkeeper of the inn he was at did the same thing to that girl's mother as the woman he killed. And so the spirit of that woman possessed the young girl to get vengeance. And that caused him to go back to being a monk and built a grave for the woman he killed and stuff like that.
Wow.
But the other one that's arguably creepier is the removable neck vampire.
Okay.
The head literally comes off and floats around and attacks people.
As it would.
And again, these are normal women during the day, and then at night, their head just pops off without them knowing it, flies around and sucks blood, and attacks people. And it was talking about the way you kill that one is put the body in a place the head can't get to. And then when day comes, it kills them because they have to be whole during the day. And it was horribly unfair because the woman didn't know she was possessed by this thing ever. So you're just killing innocent women because they're possessed by terrible monsters.
Yeah, wonderful.
And they've been looking for a cure because it can be passed down to children, apparently. I just found those weird and interesting, so I wanted to share them.
Oh, no, absolutely. No, I didn't read those ones. I got, like I said, I got sidetracked by a couple of other ones, but
I've seen art of the floating head ones where it's literally like the head, spinal cord, and lungs like floating at people.
Okay, that actually has a special name that's not Japanese, so there's a Malaysian or again another Southeast Asian one where it is a woman. It was a woman's head. Yeah, there's another one. Yeah, it was a woman's head, and it was her entrails and everything.
Yep.
Hanging from it, but they actually weren't undead. They were supposedly witches or evil women who worked with evil magic. And yet there is also in some of the mythology, the terms for revenants were either vengeful spirits, someone who had been attacked by another revenant who had risen, or witches. Because again, remember a lot of this lore mythology came up during the witch burning. Yeah, the witch burning days.
I definitely, when we do, I think we decided we're going to do zombies for one of these.
Yeah, I hope so.
I
Let's face
definitely
it,
want to
pop culture,
touch
we've
on
got
Revenant.
zombie
Yeah,
apocalypses have got to do that.
I generally want to touch on Revenants in that one because
Yep.
my knowledge of Revenants comes from D&D and a couple things, and in my opinion, they're like the only quote unquote good undead.
It depends upon
It
your
depends.
lore. Because
Yeah,
in one of the book series that I was reading, if a vampire turned into a revenant, they actually became mindless killing machines. They lost
yeah,
the aspect of their personality that prevented them from being mindless killing machines.
yeah. And the zombie necromancer book I was reading. Again, we'll go into this more during the zombie stuff, but the
Yeah.
zombie necromancer book I was reading, the revenants were still alive zombies,
Yeah.
which
Okay.
is I'll get into what that means later. But no, in D&D, revenants are spirits that have been wronged so badly in their death that they drag themselves out of the grave to kill their murderer. Yeah, and it's crazy. I've there's one written in a choose your own adventure book that I'll get into a little more. That is
Okay.
it goes into the way they think a little bit, and it's
Yeah.
chillingly awesome.
Excellent. But yeah, again, we'll go back and through some of the different historical ones because I do want to get to that little red guy that I sent a picture of for
Yes,
you.
that looked like a
Um,
frog man.
yeah, I will. Ancient Greece, though, they had the Strix. The Strix were basically giant bird women that
Yes.
killed and drank blood.
Yeah, I
There's
know about
also
Strix.
another legend in Eastern Europe was specifically around red-haired men. If a red-haired man died, he would come back in the form of an animal, would enter your home and feed on the young women.
Huh.
That was an interesting one.
That is weird.
But this little red guy, I was absolutely blown away when I found him because I found out that he is actually Indigenous Australian.
Ooh.
His name is Yaramayahu. Now, Yaramayahu, he is a little red frog-like man with a
Yes.
massive head, suckers on his fingers and toes. Now, this is another one of those, using legends and folklore to scare people into behaving. The Indigenous Australian were great in doing this with a lot of their stories.
So were
So
the Caymans.
yeah, the Yaramayahu lives in trees. And if someone unsuspectingly traveling during the day would take a nap under their tree, now it would only be during the day. The Yaramayahu does not come out at night and it does not attack people sleeping at night. But if you fell asleep under his tree during the day, the Yaramayahu would drop down, would attach to the sleeping person with its suckers on its feet and fingers, drink their blood, then proceed to swallow them whole. The Yaramayahu would then go for a drink, have a nap itself, and then go back and ultimately vomit up the person it had swallowed.
Huh.
And the person and while it was in its stomach, it was drinking more blood. And the person that got vomited back out, they would wake being a little bit smaller than they were before and slightly reddish in colour. Now, of course, even the Indigenous Australians, as dark as they can be, if they fall asleep under the Australian sun, you will get sunburnt.
Yep.
So there's the reddish tinge to say, oh, the Yaramayahu got you. What better way to threaten, oh my God, you shrunk a little bit? Because the idea is the more the Yaramayahu got you, the smaller you became until eventually you would become a Yaramayahu.
Yahoo. Yep.
And
I
it was
like that.
told,
I like that because that makes me think it's the origin for the drop bear joke.
it quite possibly is. It's quite possibly tied into one of the. It's not a koala. Koalas will not jump out of the tree, but yeah, it could be a Yaramayahu. And yeah, it just sounds the perfect little threat to tell your kids. Now you stay active, you don't fall asleep, or the Yaramayahu is going to get you. Don't be lazy. Don't have a nap.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this thing will drop out of the tree, drink your blood, eat you, then throw you back up again.
Yeah, and to me that sounds very much like something they would tell shepherds that are watching the flock during the day. You're not allowed to go take a nap under a tree. You have to tend the flock.
Which, of course, Australian Indigenous did not. They did not
Fair
keep
enough.
animals. They were hunters
That
and
makes
gatherers.
sense.
They were very nomadic, which is actually one of the reasons why. No, it was actually one of the reasons why when the first settlers came here, they did not try to treaty with the Australian Indigenous because they were seen as savages because they had no buildings or constructs to show civilization.
It's kind of the same with the American Indians.
Yeah. Whereas when they went to New Zealand, the islanders had constructs. They built buildings, and of course they had to actually treat with anyone. Any sign of building was a sign of civilization, and you had to treaty with them. If there was no buildings, it was fair game.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing here.
Yeah.
That's why we called them savages, and Pocahontas was a thing that happened.
Yeah. And the Indigenous Australians were the same. They would move around. They would follow the food. They would follow the weather. They'd follow the seasons. They had territories, and they were just nomadic. So it was those whole things like don't fall asleep during the day, or this creature would get you. Whereas usually it was the vampire was a night creature. But I just found it fascinating that Australia, we actually have our own.
I do find it fascinating that the thing would drink your blood, eat you, regurgitate you back up, and you'd be fine, when the real threat of falling asleep under a tree in Australia is some actual predator killing you.
Yeah, the creepy crawlies, especially if it's out in the bush, you got to watch the scorpions.
You
got to watch the snakes.
We have scorpions and snakes that if you fall asleep in a bush will fucking kill you. But what you really need to watch out for is this thing that will reduce your size by 5% and make you a little red.
Yep, because you were lazy. Yep.
What?
But I mean, let's face it, most folklore comes down to the trying to scare people into behaving themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, we go from this period where, yes, the vampires, it was the end of the witch burning days. People started regularly digging people up, doing all the anti-vampire things to them and burying them all over again until this Austrian queen banned it and said, no, you guys got to stop. This is messed up. Leave your dead alone. Because, of course, too, there was starting to be handling all this death is actually making people sick.
Yeah.
Digging up a rotting body, mucking around with it, and then planting it again in a time when personal hygiene was not great, made people more sick. But it's also interesting too that these tie-ins to the legends with the vampire and turning into other creatures, the bat wings and things like that. Vampire bats were discovered in 1810. So they were first documented in 1810, around the time the vampire started its transformation.
Yeah. You mentioned Duergar, and now I'm looking up Duergar. Or Duergar.
But we had all these different folklores. It was the witch burning. It's a very dark period. A lot of vampiric creatures. I mean, we knew about leeches. Leeches were pretty common knowledge, but things like that were really seen to be vampiric, like the vampire bat, comes up in 1810, and the word vampire starts becoming something that is used. I mean, the lamprey was discovered in the 1800s as well. A couple of other vampiric type creatures were being identified. I mean, the vampiric bird is actually a modern discovery. That was only recognised in the 60s or 70s. This little bird that will drink your blood. And again, these animals that are vampiric, they don't bite on and suck your blood. They cut you in some way, either bite you and allow you to bleed and literally just lap it up, like they would lap up water. So it's not an actual physical sucking process from you, like say a mosquito or something like that would do. But yeah, we went through the literary evolution started, as we said, in the 1800s with The Vampire by Polidori, and then later Bram Stoker. Now Bram Stoker, he created some lore that now becomes a bit more recognizable iconography with vampires. And it's really interesting now that as we look at some of the iconography, at how much it changes from story to story to story. And even how much vampire has shifted in the 20 years from when they were kind of really big in like the 90s, and then they kind of were reimagined again 15 to 20 years later. And we
Yeah.
saw even more of a shift away from them being villain to being something that we want. And especially in women's erotica fiction, vampires are everywhere, all through that aspect. What are the traits that most of us are familiar with the vampire? Well, typically speaking, anything is classified as a vampire if it feeds off the life force of another.
Yep.
So that's where this very, very broad spectrum of what is a vampire is huge. It's absolutely huge. So basically it needs to, well, we assume drink blood, but it can be the whole feed off the life force, which is often where the incubus and succubus, they were not always blood drinkers, but it's like they fed off sex. And there's actually a book series that uses that quite a bit.
There's a lot of series that use that quite a bit.
Yeah. Vampires always have fangs. That's usually a get-go. The vampiric iconography. The fearing sunlight thing, generally, it's become a general aspect of modern-day vampire that most can't go out in sunlight. I mean, even the sparkle ponies in Twilight kind of avoided sunlight because they sparkled. I mean, what nonsense was that? But
yeah,
I was too old for Twilight. But Bram Stoker's Dracula could go out in sunlight. He was weak during the day, but he could move about by daylight. And that was true of all the nocturnals. I guess they can move around during the day, but they lost power. At night was when they were at their full strength. So
that part of that might come, the whole daylight thing might come partly from the Norse.
yeah.
Yeah, because part of how you kill or how to prevent Duergar was the mound that represented the person needed to be opened up to purifying sunlight.
And that was because sunlight was holy.
Yeah.
And this is where some of the things that come around it, around how to defeat vampires, came from elements or aspects that were holy. And some of this predates the holy symbol idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
now, sorry,
to kill a Duergar, you have to behead it. You have to wrestle it back into its mound.
Mm-hmm.
Because weapons can't hurt it. You have to wrestle it back into its mound, which I find hilarious. Behead it, and then burn the body, and then dump the ashes into the sea.
Yep.
Which is why burning Norse on boats as you send them out to sea became a popular thing. It was to prevent Duergar.
Ah.
Or
Cool.
Draugr,
yes.
Draugr.
I mean, one of the things that we often see in vampire lore and mythology is they have an aversion to holy objects.
Yep.
Now, again, a part of that could just simply be, again, Christianity and Catholicism trying to dominate everything to say that, yes, as long as you believe in our faith, you will be safe. Yeah. There's a lot of the whole, yes, the full fear-mongering that, yes, only God's grace and God's light and God's protection can save us. So there's a lot of the whole, either it needs to be, and the item either had to be in the hands of the faithful.
Yeah.
For it to work, or blessed by a powerful priest.
Yep. And that's one of the things that, like, because Vampire the Masquerade is a lot of where my vampire lore comes from, vampire entertaining stuff comes from. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things is there is actually a trait you can take, even as a vampire, called true faith. And that is the only way to, and it doesn't matter what your faith is. But as long as you believe in what you're holding can hurt a vampire with everything you have in true faith, it will hurt a vampire.
Yeah. And that to me would make sense. And there is, again, one of the book series that I read, it didn't matter what the symbol of faith was. If it was held by the faithful, it had faith because it was all connected to the divine, and God is God. And it's just their way of connecting to God, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So a symbol of faith in the hands of the faithful would fight back evil. That was the whole deal.
Yeah.
Again, it depends upon the law, but this seems to have become a standard in most vampire stories and vampire lore, that vampires cannot stand to face holy objects. The only modern one I personally have seen that didn't do that was True Blood.
Yeah.
They didn't. It was geography as far as they were concerned. Or geometry. Sorry, it had no effect on them whatsoever. But again, it was one of those. These are evil creatures, and good. The holy will fight it back. It was the same reason why they couldn't stand on consecrated ground, where if you stayed in a church, you were safe.
Yeah.
The allergic to silver and the aversion to garlic, those aspects are often tied into, again, the undead folklore.
Yeah.
Usually in most vampiric stories, garlic either is mildly irritating or doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's just like, the whole thing is a lot of garlic used to be good for fighting off infections.
Yep.
And again, in the days when you didn't know what an infection was and you thought it was some evil thing and they ate a lot of garlic and they got better, obviously garlic will fight off evil.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's just good for you. It might make you sweat and your BO stink, but it is actually really good for you.
That's why I love, again, going back to Vampire the Masquerade, there's a whole section where they're talking about the traditional weaknesses, and he's like, garlic, I love that shit. It's great on pizza. Because, that book is written really interesting because you're being told the rules of being a vampire by a vampire.
Okay, the no reflection thing is, it depends. Again, it depends on the story, depends on the law. It was big in Bram Stoker. A lot of modern day, it doesn't make any difference because they want them to be on camera, if they want them to be able to go on television and stuff. Obviously, if it doesn't work in a mirror, it shouldn't work on camera, blah, 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 blah. They've just dumped that.
Yeah, because the whole idea was the mirror is a reflection of your soul, and vampire doesn't have souls. It's the same. You couldn't take a picture of a vampire for the same reason. You couldn't.
Because, and that goes back into the whole, you're actually capturing a piece of somebody's soul every time you take a photo.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, and that's a little creepy in and of itself. Generally speaking, most vampire lore, a vampire cannot enter unless they've been invited. I cannot find any real origin to this, again, other than certain, urban legends and pop culture. There are elements as to, certain energies need to be invited into your home. There are aspects on witchcraft that's, again, if you've got certain protections and wards, nothing can cross without permission.
Yeah,
I think it was one of those. A lot of this, while I was reading it, it's just like, it just sounds like they added these things so you wouldn't be absolutely terrified all the time.
Yeah, because honestly, if a vampire could just walk into your effing house without permission, they become 1,000 times more terrifying, because what's to stop them?
Exactly. And especially when you start adding in things like the fact that they can mess with your mind. Most modern day vampires have an element of hypnosis. They can charm, they can mesmerize. Some can go as far as wiping your memory and getting you to do what they want you to do.
Yep.
But there is that mesmerizing aspect that is associated with it. I mean, most vampires, we know they tend to be fast, strong, hard to kill, although kind of flammable.
Little flammable. It's fine.
Little flammable. Flying, again, depends on the vampire, depends on the lore. Some need to be able to transform into some other element, whether it be the mist, whether it be a bat, or something that actually allows them to fly. In some vampire stories, the vampire can just fly. Again, you go into True Blood, some vampires can fly, some vampires can't. It depended on the vampire and what their natural talent was. So it is a very whatever. The transforming
has very interesting ways about handling that too.
They can also transform into animals, or some lore allows them to transform into animals, usually creatures of the dark. I mean, if you watched Bram Stoker's Dracula, you see things like the bats, the rats.
Wolves, one
wolves used to come at his command. I don't think he actually transformed into one, but they served him.
Yeah, Bram Stoker, that's how that worked. But there is some vampire lore that's like, no, they can turn into wolves too. Wolves are seen as evil creatures, which makes a lot of sense because if you think about a scared villager, wolf is something that will drag you off into the woods.
Yeah, this is true too. And it's interesting though, even though they were creatures of folklore, that was never cat. Cat was more seen as a ward against rather than the creature of darkness itself. But the big thing is vampires generally were solitary. I mean, a collective name for a group of vampires is commonly a kiss, but usually they are seen as solitary creatures. And again, that ties these, dark, brooding, solitary, traumatized, emotional, ties them into teen, especially modern day teenagers. The rise of emo and all that stuff, it all came up around the same time as vampire. As the vampires became big. And yeah, as we said at the beginning, that we loved them because they cheated death.
Yep.
Especially in the old days where death was a lot easier, it was a lot faster. You could die so much more quickly.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
The ability to cheat death.
Days.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to keep making that joke because people are like, oh, the good old days where everything was simpler. And it's like, yes, and you could die because it's Tuesday.
Yes, exactly. Life was very, very cheap in those days. That's what a lot of people tend to forget. But again, vampire really has been idolized in a lot of ways by feminine, especially, again, teenage feminine, because the vampire energy tends to be a very masculine energy, even though the original demonic elements of were portrayed as feminine. Vampire, through the means of biting, is masculine because he penetrates.
Yeah. And
when you especially look at the iconography of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula was very, very Persephone in Hades. Mm-hmm. He was very much dark masculine energy, where he was, yes, brooding and solitary and all these things, but he sees his woman and it's all about her.
Yeah.
Everything he had, and this is what really romanticized him, especially for feminine, is this masculine, this ancient masculine. Yes, he was dark, yes, he was evil, he was powerful, all these things, but he was all about his woman.
Yeah.
Which again is Hades and Persephone, all about his woman.
Yeah.
Everything focuses in on her joy, her passion. And the thing was, is he didn't want to dominate or to possess her. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, he didn't want, she almost forced him to make her what he was. He didn't want to condemn her. He loved her so much.
Yeah.
He didn't want to condemn her. And she's like, I don't care. I want to be with you. Anything, be with you. I feel it. I know it. I know it in my soul. And so it brings up this romance with the bad boy.
Which is one of the big, I wanted to point this out a little. You're going into the romance. They always show male vampires in a romantic light. If it's aimed at women, it's always a attractive male vampire trying to romance a female. When they target vampires towards men, it's all about fucking.
It is in porn. Feminine vampire is huge, but there is an element on that sexuality aspect that, again, it allows a very powerful feminine to almost be masculine without messing with sexuality.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because she can be the dominatrix, she's the demon, she's the seductress, and allows a masculine to be penetrated himself.
Yeah, because I was going to point out Blood Rain is all about you're a female vampire in very tight leather with much skin exposed. And the way she feeds is usually like jumping up on them, wrapping her legs around them and biting them in the face.
And that, again, it has been very, very sexualized from the modern day. Because we do have, there is that element where there is that aspect of seductiveness from the dark. From the forbidden, from those elements that we're told, that's bad, that's naughty, and we're going, hey, actually, it's just kind of kinky.
Yeah. And then the other vampire game I was going to point out, I'm only going to briefly touch on both of these because they were both like in my opinion, granted, I haven't played too far into either of them. They're both very shallow games. It's all about, hey, you're a vampire, murder everybody.
Yeah.
The other one was Dark Watch, where you played a guy named Jericho Cross. Let that name sink in for a minute. Who gets turned into a vampire, and like the scene where you get turned into a vampire is literally you've stormed a castle and you're fucking a woman fully dressed. She's not, but you are on top of a castle in a rainstorm, and then she bites you. It's the weirdest scene and makes no fucking sense compared to the rest of the game.
Well, I think you've opened up a really good door now. So let's really have a look into our vampires in our pop culture, because this is where they are. In how we know them now, they are all through our TV, our videos, our movies, our games.
Yeah.
I mean, you've talked a bit about Masquerade. My favorite, when I was a bit younger, my favorite was Legacy of Kain and Soul Reaver.
By the way, I absolutely need you to get you to play Vampire the Masquerade at least once. I think you would absolutely adore the system.
Probably would. It sounds like a lot of fun to me.
Because it's
right up my alley.
Vampire's done a little more maturely, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think that was actually why when we came out of Bram Stoker and Interview with the Vampire, and then they kind of twilighted all over it. Yeah. But we also ended up with things like True Blood. Yeah. True Blood to me felt like the grown-up vampire, and Twilight was this washed-out teeny bopper thing. But I loved Legacy of Kain. Legacy of Kain, he was a very old world kind of vampire, especially in the first one. Rain, he was affected by rain. He was affected by running water. Yeah. Actually, that running water thing has been a really interesting one, because I did a lot of research trying to figure out why are they, what is this deal about vampires can't cross running water? Now, the only modern day connection to modern day vampires I found was there was a reference in one of either Interview with the Vampire or one of the Anne Rice books along those lines that literally said that running water marked vampire territory. And so they usually wouldn't leave their territory. By crossing water, you would enter someone else's territory. However, I feel that the old world, the spiritual source of that was like sunshine. Running water was conceived to be clean and sacred. Yeah. And so anything evil, if something evil was chasing you, cross running water. The thing was, though, was to cross the water, not the bridge. If you crossed the bridge, it could follow you. If you crossed the water itself, it couldn't. Yeah. So there was that.
There's probably also an aspect of things lose your scent across running water.
There is that too, but it was just the whole simple, evil things can't, or the undead. Yeah. It's more the undead, I think, can't cross running water.
Well, my thought pattern there is it's one of those things where they didn't understand why things wouldn't chase them across running water.
Yeah.
And so they just thought it was holy and whatnot.
Yeah. But in that too, they, running water in those days was also a purer water. It's like if water was slow moving, it could have a lot more pollutants. Running tended to be cleaner. So there was the purity of it. Also, from an energetic perspective, water does cleanse. It does remove negative energies. It can wash crap away. So from that energetic perspective, yes, it would work in that way too. But because Kain, Legacy of Kain. I mean, Kain in Soul Reaver turned into the villain, which was an interesting take. I struggled when I first started playing Soul Reaver, because it's like, but I loved Kain. Kain was awesome. Yes, he was the bad guy, but again, it wasn't just about running around killing people. There was actually a mission and a purpose, and it was usually to undo an evil worse than Kain himself. So. And then Soul Reaver came along because Kain became the worst evil, and then there was something else going along, and they had to work together in the end to defeat. I think it was Mobius or Morpheus or something along that. It was Mobius. The ultimate bad guy.
Continuum.
Yeah.
His one-dimensional continuum. Oh, that just reminded me. You mentioned it about one of my favorite vampire books of all time, which is the Necroscope series. And while it itself is not about a vampire, the main character is a medium. He can speak to the and kind of becomes a necromancer in a lot of ways, because he like the dead love him so much they will pull themselves out of their graves to defend him.
That was the one you've been talking about,
Yeah, that's the old book series that I liked growing up. But what he fights most of the time is vampires. Like, they're the enemy that he deals with a lot of the time. And you mentioned Mobius, and that reminded me that Harry Coase actually talked to Mobius and learned all about the continuum and found a way to enter the continuum to travel through space and time.
I think there was an element of that in the last Kane, Legacy of Kane Soul Reaver, where it actually crossed over and you played as both.
Yeah.
The final one where you actually played as both. I wish I could get my hands on that game again. I loved that.
Yeah.
But it was all, I mean, Legacy of Kane Soul Reaver, I loved that little franchise. As far as games go, obviously Castlevania was a big one, but again, you're fighting the vampires rather than empowering them. Of course, sorry?
There was a long, talking about video games, there was a long stretch where we didn't have vampire video games for a while. Like, Dark Watch was an older game. A lot of those were older games, and then there was just nothing with vampires until recently. One came out that was called Vampire. It's just Vampire, but it was spelled Pyr,
which is the old Eastern Europe spelling.
Which was I misspoke when I sent the text. I thought it was just called Pyre, but it's Vampire.
Vampire. Yeah.
And it's about a surgeon in World War I who becomes a vampire, and I haven't played it, but I've heard, I thought it was terribly received and this and that, but apparently it was actually well received from what I was reading.
Cool.
And that's kind of one of the most recent ones. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, when I went looking for it, there wasn't a lot. I mean, no. Blood Rain is out there. Yes, of course, the Legacy of Kane and Soul Reaver is out there. Elder Scrolls is listed a bit because you can become a vampire. You can
become a vampire. In Skyrim, one of the expansions is entirely about vampires.
Yeah.
They added a super powered vampire mode you can get, and they also added a bunch of things for killing vampires.
Yeah. Again, as we mentioned earlier, D&D. You've got Curse of Strahd is the primary one, and there's a few other campaigns that work around Strahd and Barovia as well, aren't there?
Yeah, there's at least one more. There's an entire, at least in 3rd edition, somebody created, because D&D is split into many different realms. And whatever core rule book you have is one realm. It was Greyhawk up until 5th edition, 4th or 5th edition. It became Faerun, and which used to be called Forgotten Realms. It used to be its own realm called the Forgotten Realms. But when Gygax died, they decided to stop using Greyhawk and start using Forgotten Realms, because that was more popular with the people. Because Gygax's world was Greyhawk, which is why everything was in Greyhawk. Ravenloft is its own, like Forgotten Realms and whatnot. It's its own campaign setting.
Yep. Yeah, because whole Barovia was its own. It's trapped. It's trapped in between realms.
Yep. And the books, I own a bunch of the old TSR books.
Yeah.
I think TSR makes them. I don't actually know who makes them, but I own a couple of the Ravenloft series books, and they're all weird horror books. I haven't read them. I just have them.
But yeah, I mean, vampire as an element in gaming more often than not is something for you to fight rather than something for you to be. So it's still villainesque more than anything else. Whereas in our television and our movies, they can take on different forms. Now, Bram Stoker's Dracula that they made again in the 90s. As I said, with Gary Oldman and Winona Ryder was done brilliantly for the time and really brought the legends to life.
Yeah.
Interview with the Vampire, as much as I can't stand Tom Cruise, and I will say I'm not a big Brad Pitt fan either. It was done beautifully. It was again helped romanticize it. They still kept their monstrous elements, but made them relatable, especially with the girl. All of those elements. Then, of course, after Interview with the Vampire, they did Queen of the Damned, which
is sad because She died partway through
She,
filming that.
yes, that was tragic.
So
I
they
mean,
had
it
to cut
wasn't,
out a bunch of her scenes and shit.
and yeah, it ended up not being all it could have been. The
Yeah.
movie had potential, but it didn't flow well, and that was because yes, they lost the woman who played the Queen of the Damned.
Yeah.
Akasha, I think her name was.
I don't
Something
remember
along
her
those
name.
lines. Yeah.
It's been too
Anyway,
long.
but yeah, again, it wasn't not like Interview. Interview was seen as this artistic masterpiece, whereas Queen of the Damned came across, it was kind of cheap, and it didn't have the class, shall we
Yeah.
say, that Interview had.
Yeah.
There was a whole
And then
bunch of movies through those series. There was also some stupid comedies. There was one with Leslie Nielsen called Dracula Dead and Loving
Dead and
It.
Loving It. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
haven't
and then
seen that since I was a kid.
of course, in your movies you also have Blade,
Yes.
the
Blade, though,
Daywalker.
he is a Dampier.
Yes.
He is
Which also
Dampier,
is a
so
D&D.
yeah. Well, obviously D&D got the reference from, again, a European term for a person or one who was born of human and vampire, usually human female and vampire male.
Yeah, I was just pointing out it as D&D race. I know that's not where it came from.
Yeah. But yes, a Blade was the Daywalker. And the Daywalker aspect appears a little bit more. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter.
Okay. At some point, I'm going to rip this conversation straight into Vampire the Masquerade, and that'll be like a 20-minute deal. So go ahead.
Yeah, we're on our ways to that. Anita Blake, I love the lore that Anita Blake, the Vampire Hunter, uses. Now, primarily, it is a book series. There's nearly 30 books in this series. It isn't just vampire. There's a lot of shapeshifter or lycanthrope or therianthrope, as it often, or as later has been referred to. Post book 10, it actually turned into some pretty hardcore erotica there for a while. But it was interesting the way vampirism was presented in this particular series. Although, yes, they were known as the undead and all that sort of thing, in society, they had been made legal citizens and were considered to be sufferers of a disease.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were generally considered to be pretty much the same before and after. It's just literally you'd wake up and you were a vampire and you were still you.
Yeah.
Yes, you died at dawn and woke again in the evening, but you were ultimately still you.
Yeah. The Masquerade touches on that a bit.
And they could have babies. So between a vampire and a human, they could have a child. But it was interesting, if the child was human, it would all be fine. Although it's very high risk of losing the baby, but there was always a chance the baby could be a vampire. And if the baby was a vampire, it would usually have to terminate the pregnancy because it would kill the mother, literally eat the mother from the inside.
Yeah.
Which was fantastic. There was a lot of good elements about the whole Anita Blake series in the whole vampire element, where she was not one of those that was instantly bedazzled. She actually wanted to kill them. And the first 6 Anita Blakes were actually Marvel comics. And that was just before it started getting a little bit too raunchy.
Yeah. Yeah. It turns out, side fact, the reason Marvel Comics don't get into sex that much and stuff like that is because Marvel and DC, from my understanding, Marvel and DC signed a thing a long time ago to keep comics away from that because they didn't want to resort to that kind of thing to sell comics.
Yeah, which makes sense. I mean, the sexualization of the feminine was just in how they were dressed, mostly in those comics and things. But yeah, and she was this, again, she's one of those heroes that came in kick-ass, but she came in kick-ass and angry. Yeah. And as the series progressed, she wasn't so angry anymore. But Anita also brings in the element of the energy vampire, which I want to go into a lot more a little bit later. So I will leave that aspect to one side. The other series that I really got into, I want to touch on a little bit, was True Blood. However, I made the terrible mistake. I watched the first season, thought this is awesome, I love this, went out and read the books, and then proceeded to watch the rest of the TV series. And yeah, I couldn't watch it after. I think season 4 was the last time I could really get into the series. They went
Yep.
so far off the books that I just, no, I can't do this anymore. They changed characters so completely, omitted people, and it lost me. And then, of course, the books started to lose me too, because I feel the author, as the TV series went further and further away from her work, I felt the author just didn't want it anymore.
Yeah.
But the Vampire Diaries and the originals were also out around the same time. I could not get into either of them.
Sarah watches them religiously.
There's something about them, I just cannot get into them. And as much as I love vampire stuff, I struggle.
They're very drama heavy. It's more a teen drama with vampires attached to it.
That's where it loses me. It's like, I love the whole vampire lore. I love the dark. I love the underworld. I liked True Blood because it was the grown-up aspect of it. I like Anita Blake because it's the grown-up aspect of it. Again, Anita and True Blood both had elements of erotica. So does the Black Dragger Brotherhood, which is another, sort of erotica.
Again, romance. Sarah reads those religiously too.
It appeals to feminine. Again, the
never
whole
touched that book,
aspect.
and I know a fair bit about it.
But yeah, it connects to, again, it's they've been very, very romanticized, very, very much so. But
Blind King.
And of course, though, what I forgot to mention is smack bang in the middle there, we also had Buffy and Angel.
Yeah, which were like they played around. Honestly, Whedon is a fantastic writer for writing characters as people, and that's so that he did a very good job of keeping them realistic and not lovey-dovey stupid.
Yeah,
in my opinion,
there were good elements. There were enough of that there to satisfy. Although Buffy's tormented love life was a thing. I personally was a big fan of Spike, and I hated how she ended up treating him towards the end. However, it popped up on my YouTube. It popped up on my YouTube feed for some reason, and I still don't know why, but there were a series of interviews done with James Masters.
Yeah.
And it was talking about why Joss Whedon, hated Spike. And James had said that it was simply that the whole premise of it were the vampires were the evil that the teenagers had to overcome. And the whole premise was it was evil to be vanquished or evil to be overcome. And all of a sudden, here comes this bad guy that everybody loves. And it kind of broke the premise.
Yeah. The problem with Buffy and Angel, in my opinion, is it got so popular that the network shoved their foot straight up it. And it started to kill a lot of Joss's creative ideas.
Yeah. I feel that they forced him to keep the characters too much the same. And you really noticed it in the last season where everyone really should be broken, and they were most of the time. But then every now and then they would have them revert back to their old characters, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
Buffy was broken. Willow, her confidence was shattered. Xander lost his eye. All of these things where these people should have, if they were real people, wouldn't flip back into their teenager, their little teen speak way of being. That I felt kind of destroyed it.
It also helps that Joss hated the last season of Buffy.
Yeah, and you can tell that was the same thing that I noticed with True Blood, with the book series. I could tell the author was done with what they had done to her work and how they had changed it, but she was still contracted to write so many more books. I personally could not bring myself to read the last book.
Yeah, because anybody who doesn't know, the last season of Buffy and the last 2 seasons of Angel, I believe, because I think Angel ran 1 season longer than Buffy did. Joss wanted to work on a completely different project, and the network told him he wasn't allowed. He had to focus on Buffy and Angel.
Yeah,
And to tell a creative, huh? Go ahead.
anyone in the biz knew it was Firefly.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah. And so the whole thing is though is you can't tell a creative person what they're allowed to work on and what they're not allowed to work on because it kills the creative spark and they just don't care anymore.
Perfect example of that is Da Vinci.
Yeah.
It took him years and years and years and years and years to do certain or finish certain commissioned pieces because he would work on what he felt like working on. And if you wanted his genius, you had to wait until he was able to create that. And that is true for creative. Creative energy is very, very feminine. It is a very feminine aspect because it's about birthing. It's about creating. And in order to do that, the juices need to be flowing, and you can't force that. You can force the lineal, you can force certain aspects of it, but true creation needs to flow. And the moment it gets forced comes through. But yeah, we saw it in Buffy and Angel. I saw it in True Blood, where I will say that the book series sometimes the Sookie Stackhouse mysteries, but the original books were actually called the Southern Vampire Chronicles.
Huh. I'll have to look at that then. Then of course the network also killed Firefly, which Joss was like, all right, I'm fucking done.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you don't blame him. You really don't blame him for being forced to do something. Because yes, and it is, I mean, you see it with the networks all the time. You see how they're tempted to force these TV series to keep going when they should have just wrapped it up. Yeah. Let it be epic. Let it be legendary. Let it be something that we always do want more, but leave it.
Yeah.
Because the moment you start giving more and there isn't that much more content or quality, there's no point making it in the first place. You end up actually trashing the iconography that you had created. Because, the first 5 seasons of Buffy were awesome.
Yeah.
But, the last 2, you could see he wasn't as engaged. You could see he was going through the motions. You can feel it.
Yep. Yeah, there was a brilliant comic I read a while ago talking about the biggest problem with TV shows and creative things is the management above them that's telling the creatives what they can and cannot do.
And again, having no, it's all about the money, about how much more money can we milk out of this concept. And it's like, no, you can't. Yeah. We will leave this and start a new concept. You can reimagine this concept later.
Yeah. Because the funniest part and probably the most true part about that is the best way to make money on a creative project is to not try to monetize, try to force the monetization. Because as soon as you do that, you kill the creativity.
Yeah. And also this is something that a lot of people know, we can feel it.
Yeah.
We can feel when it's a money grab. We can feel when it is done with something ulterior in mind. When you do something sheerly for the love of it, people feel it.
Yeah.
And this is one of those big aspects of just awakening in general. We're becoming more aware that we can feel it. People are becoming more aware. It's like, oh, that's what that is. Okay. Now I know. I can keep my eye out for that in future.
Yep. But back on some of the topics. Back to the vampire.
Back to the vampire.
The vampire. No, I was going to cut in a bit and be like, I think you would really enjoy The Masquerade because The Masquerade is a look at vampires from a human perspective. Yeah. In a very adult way. The best phrase, and of course it is a role-playing game, so it's entirely up to your own, how monstrous do you want to be with your character kind of concepts. But it's the whole idea, and one of the catchphrases is beast I am, less beast I become. And the idea is you have to let Jacob Burgess, who is a fantastic human being and a great I forget the storyteller term for vampire, but I watched his vampire series, and I should send it to you to watch because it is very good. He talks a lot about the whole point is you have to give into the beast just a little bit so the beast doesn't take you over. Because being a vampire is like having a wolf buried in your chest that wants to eat everything around you, and you trying to keep hold of it so it doesn't.
That comes down to I think, again, that split element of lore where some vampires are, like in the Buffy universe, the vampire is actually a demon possessing the person who died's body. Whereas,
Correct.
again, you go to Anita Blake, you go to True Blood, they're just who they were when they died.
Yep. Yes, and it is like, because that's part of the reason I wanted to bring up Vampire the Masquerade, is because you mentioned that, and that is a big part of it, is trying to keep yourself, keep your humanity, and not give in to the dark thing inside of you that's trying to you know, do whatever it wants. And what it generally wants to do is eat, because it is very animalistic.
As you say that, I actually see that in the Anita Blake series, because there is a way. Ultimately, the vampire, as they're created, is more the product of their creation.
Yep.
And so, if the vampire that sired them, because that seems to be the term in vampire lore, is the vampire that sired them is good, quotation marks, then the vampire that was sired will ultimately be well behaved as well.
Yeah.
And the only time they become truly dangerous is if they don't have their master. If they can cut off from the power of their bloodline, or they're starving.
Yep. Anita sounds like she took a lot from, when was the Anita Blake series written?
Anita Blake series has been, I mean, there's 30 books. She's been writing it for 20 years, I think.
Yeah, so it was written around 2000.
I would have to look that up, but who knows?
That's why I was asking, because the Masquerade was. Go ahead.
Nothing. I'll look it up. You talk.
Yeah, because Vampire the Masquerade was created in 91. Yeah, and it really sounds like they took a lot from that, which is a fantastic place to take it from. Because it's all about bloodlines. Like Vampire the Masquerade is all about bloodlines. Your bloodline determines your power set. Your bloodline determines, this and that. How close you are to the progenitor also makes you more powerful. So what generation you are, all those kind of things. Interesting lore to there is the first vampire was Cain, created by, again, Lilith, who was the first demon. Because they follow what's called the Book of Nod, which I don't know is an actual religious text or not in real life, but I know in there it is a book of the Bible that was deemed unholy. And it talks about, and nobody knows for sure. That's the other thing in Vampire the Masquerade, is nobody really knows where they came from, but their best running theory is that Lilith created Cain as the first vampire, and from his blood he created 13 children, which is the beginning of each of the bloodlines.
Which again, I think is why they tie back into the whole legacy of Cain, even though Cain in that series was not the Cain.
Yeah,
I think naming him that was a very deliberate thing.
Of course,
Anita Blake was 92, 93 was the first book.
So it came out just after Vampire the Masquerade. I wouldn't say that she did definitely take things from Vampire the Masquerade, but there's a very good chance that she got some inspiration from the rule set.
It's probably all intertwined. Again, that was around the age or the era that we started seeing. Like I said, Bram Stoker was around that time too.
Yeah, that's fair. But other interesting things, because we were talking about the origins, like what creates a vampire a bit. In the Necroscope, it's actually a parasite in your body that slowly takes over your mind.
That was a little bit in The Strain as well. There was a TV series called The Strain with some kind of evil vampiric worm thing. That was trippy.
Which is very similar to how it works in the Necroscope, because he describes it. It's like a leech that is wrapped around your intestinal tract, and comes up through your mouth. And actually, the vampire fangs are its mouth that it has replaced your mouth with, if I remember correctly.
It sounds very similar to The Strain.
That book series was messed up. The other weird thing about it is how you become a vampire in that one is a vampire. The actual creature inside only ever produces one offspring in its entire life, and it places that in a new human being.
Wow.
Through the back of the neck, which is weird. It dissolves into the back of your neck.
Awesome.
Yeah. drops from a tree in one of the book series, because one of them, there's an old vampire that's buried, and the guy finds it, and it's still alive, just buried. And he talks to it and this and that. He feeds it blood by dropping blood on the ground and this and that. And inevitably, it works up one of its tentacles up into a tree nearby and drops a baby onto the back of his neck.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's creepy. That book series is so weird but good. Also, for some reason, vampires had invaded the KGB,
As
and
they
the
would.
KGB is just a front for vampires in that book series, which is just weird. And the British Central Intelligence Agency is a front for psychic people who stop vampires. It's kind of what it boils down to.
Oh, wonderful.
It's lovely and weird. But no, Vampire the Masquerade, like I was saying, it has 13 bloodlines, 13 clans, if I remember correctly. And they range, like each one is a different, kind of represents a different aspect of vampirism.
Yeah.
You have like one of them that idolizes beauty and all things beautiful.
Yeah.
You have one of them that's very like authoritarianism. They care about bloodlines. They care about this and that, kind of like royalty, a lot of ways, nobility.
Yeah.
You have ones that are very animalistic, and they're the ones that can shapeshift. So that's why I was saying it depends on the lore, because Gangrel can turn into wolves.
Yep.
And bats and a couple other things. You have the Nosferatu was one of the bloodlines. And their big thing was, okay, each bloodline has a bunch of special advantages and one massive disadvantage.
Yep.
The Troubadour, which are the ones that are obsessed with beauty, they get blinded by beauty. So if something extremely beautiful crosses their path, they will actually stop whatever they're doing to stare at it. Like, it's a compulsion. They can't help it.
Cool.
I don't actually know the royal one, and I forget their name right now. I don't remember what their downside was. Sadly, they may have also been the Troubadour, which would be funny as hell. No, then there's the magic ones who are obsessed with magic and blood magic, and their downside is they randomly can catch on fire.
Yay.
That's not exactly their downside, but they're very secretive is actually what their downside is. But in older editions, you could take fire magic and accidentally light yourself on fire trying to cast a spell. So that's where that joke came from. I think they got rid of that in the most recent one, and they only have blood magic now. But fire magic starts with a small fire in your palm that sometimes will catch you on fire and you will die. Then there is the Nosferatu, which are very good at ferreting out secrets. Very good at ferreting out secrets. Their downside is they're hideous as shit. Their beast alters their physical form to make them more beast-like. So they have like big bat ears and are there's a couple movies I think that have shown the kind of bat boy looking thing. And that's the Nosferatu. My favorite clan is the Bruja. The Bruja are anarchists, kind of. That's like their symbol is an upside down anarchy symbol because it stands for vampire with a line through it. It's kind of funny. They're basically big biker bastards. That like they talk about history a lot in there, and they're like the Bruja used to be warrior poets. They forgot poetry and learned how to murder people better. Like along the way. And their power set is a lot of strength based. They're super strong. They're super fast. They're very physical. Their downside is they have rage. In older editions, every time you did certain things that would anger you, you had to make a will check, and if you failed, you would go into a blind rage and kill everything in the room. Friend, foe, didn't matter. You'd kill it.
Yay.
And in that edition, in third edition, you could mix powers. You could get powers from other sets, from other clans. It just cost you more XP. to do so. And there was a power set you weren't allowed to take. If you took the gangrel claws and a couple of the Bruja abilities, if your GM was smart, he wouldn't let you, because literally the Bruja would go berserk and kill the entire party in about 2 seconds.
Wow.
Guaranteed. He would guarantee kill the entire party in 1 round, because of course they have vampires, like bullets barely hurt them, all these things, but there are certain things that do, and vampire claws, like if you have the claw mutation, is lethal damage to vampires. So you'd have a Bruja with this claw mutation that would be strong enough to kill a vampire, literally do 10 damage in 1 hit, which is the max damage in that game, and would just kill the entire party, and then have something that gives him a bunch of extra rounds in combat. So you just turn both of those on, get like 6 rounds in combat, kill everybody in 1 hit.
There are definite elements there that I can see to tie into the sort of the same world that Laurel Hamilton made for Anita Blake.
Yeah.
Because there were distinct bloodlines. Now, there was similarities there. Well, what you were talking about kind of ties us into where I wanted to go anyway, whereas in the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, there are bloodlines. Ultimately, it all comes out of Europe. They use a lot of French terms. I haven't read for a little while, so I'm not up to date with all of them. I think it was the sort of saying it's like the fountain of blood or the head of the bloodlines.
Yeah.
But each of the bloodlines also had the ability to feed on energies. Now, the bloodline Anita got tied into was, again, it was the beautiful, the line of Belmort, which was beautiful death. And this bloodline can feed on sex. So they can feed on energy and on basically not just even physical sex, but just on the energy of lust in a room.
Yeah.
You can build up lust in the room. They could feed off that energy. There was one bloodline that fed on fear, the ability your innermost fear was, and to make you think it, to feel it, to bring up fear so they could eat and feed off your fear. Yeah. There was one bloodline that fed on death itself, so the more death it could create, the more it got to eat. Anita even brought up her own ability, which was to eat rage. She could eat anger. And just had this natural ability to be able to feed off other people's anger. When she did, she actually made them really calm. But if she ate too much, she could literally wipe their memories, wipe their identities. But this leads us into what we know about, shall we use quotation marks, real vampires.
Mm-hmm.
Now, no, I do not believe there are blood-sucking, pointy teeth creatures running around in the night, unless there's someone that's had a lot of body augmentation and has some mental health issues. I don't feel that there is the physical being of.
Side note, I do know there are some sexual fetishists who do drink blood. It's not exactly a mental health problem, but it is a thing that people do.
Yeah, it is all there is the sexuality, the sexualization of they classify themselves as vampires. But again, when we're talking the mythological creature, that is what I'm talking to. There is I do not believe we have immortal mythological creatures out there biting us and drinking our blood. Energy vampires are a real thing. And any person out there who says, oh, yeah, you're talking shit, have you ever been in the company of someone who sucked the life out of you? Have you ever spent time in the company of someone who, when you left their company, you were drained?
Yeah.
That is an energy vampire. Now, I firstly want to stress that this is not being mean, horrible, calling out energy vampires, because I was one. I will absolutely and totally own that as a teenager, and even in my early 20s, I was a horrific energy vampire because I had depression. I was an empath. I was a natural psychic. I had chronic depression. And yeah, I sucked the life out of people.
Now, granted, that doesn't mean that if you have depression, you're an energy vampire, by the way.
No, it doesn't. But it's one of these things that when you are in those low energy ways, that we will often seek out certain people, certain company, certain places, because they boost energy. Okay. Understand, most people that are energy vampires have no clue what it is that they are doing, have no clue about it. It is simply this energy of being, I mean, especially empaths, people who naturally have some psychic abilities can often become vampires. Broken empaths become vampires very easily, usually not knowing what it is that they are doing. And it's simply seeking out people who make them feel better. Now, most people do this. Most of us do this. It's like if you're in a down way, you want to find the company that lifts you up. We look for people that make us feel better.
Yeah.
But if we are that person to somebody else, the person that is in those down states literally can drain us, can physically and energetically and emotionally drain us. Again, this is not deliberate on their part. Deliberate energy vampirism is rare. It is really, really rare. So most of the time, if somebody has sucked some energy from you, they had no clue what they were doing. They literally just wanted to be around you because you made them feel better.
Yeah.
How do we deal with it? We show them love and we hold really good boundaries for ourselves.
Yep.
When you have the ability, the energy, the time to give somebody who can drain you at times, as much as you love them and as much as you can care about them, can kind of drain you dry, then energize yourself, knowing that they need this from you. Go give them your light, give them your abundance, give them your energy, spend time just in their company and let your energy bring them up. But hold your own boundaries. Know when it is healthy for you to do this and when it is not. Don't just let people drain you dry constantly, because it will just, it self-perpetuates. It ends up creating another energy vampire. Introverts ultimately tend to avoid a lot of high energy places because of the amount of energy they absorb. It can set them off. It can make them uneasy. It literally can be absorbing so much energy from so many different sources that it makes them rattled and they need to go back and hermit again, go back into their cave.
Yep.
Whereas extroverts going into the same situation, that energy can build them up, can actually lift them and elevate them rather than suck them down. But there's an interesting little visualization that you can do, that if you are on that more introverted and you need to be able to deal with people more, I always see it as like there's a valve. We have this valve inside us. So the energy is coming in and it's being drawn to this valve. Now, if the valve is working like a drain, that energy can pull us down.
Yeah.
But if you can, in your mind's eye, flip that valve over, because it does flip, you can actually flip it, and that same energy, rather than sucking you down, can actually lift you up. Just a very simple little visualization to help open and to bring your energy up. So this energy energizes you rather than sucks the life out of you. Again, if it serves the situation. Sometimes it serves the situation to do that. Other times it means do what is natural for you and then go home and hermit. Wash people off. Always, if you've been in a toxic environment, surrounded by people that were draining you dry, as soon as you get home, have a shower. Okay. Again, crossing running water. The energy washes, the water washes that energy off. There's a lot of things that says, oh, man-made taps and faucets and things like that don't work. It's the same concept. It works. If it works for crystals and things like that, it works for people. And I personally find a shower very, very good at clearing off other people's energies or negative energies that I've picked up from people that I've been working with.
I mean, I bathe every Thursday. I bathe more than every Thursday, but I ritualistically bathe every Thursday because it's Thursday.
Yeah, for me, every time I have finished with clients for the day, I will have a shower to wash their energy off me, so I'm not sitting around with other people's energies, pain, hurt, whatever, on me, because it does affect me, and it affects me quite strongly. And this is one of those things that as you go on your life path and you're in your awakening path, these energies become stronger. They become harder to ignore. So again, being aware of it, it's like, okay, I've just finished this situation and now I'm exhausted. Who was I with? Oh, that's right. What's his face? He's been depressed all week since his relationship ended, blah, blah, blah. I feel them sucking my energy.
Yep.
Like I said, the best way to deal with that is to just literally send them a great big ball of love energetically. It's just send them that love, that understanding, that compassion, and then close yourself off to it. Whatever works for you. Find a visualization that works that can help you shut down that energy, whether it be force fields, whether you lock yourself behind a steel door, whether you cut up. I like the Stargate's iris. That works really well. You can shut that down, closes it down the gate porthole, stops the energy from coming through. Whatever visualization works, do what works for you.
Yep. So we are coming to the end of our time.
Yes, indeed we are. Which is good because I think I've gone through enough today.
Awesome. I apologize if I've cut you off a few too many times this episode.
That's all right. I've talked a lot. Like I said, this is such a juicy episode, and I love vampires. I love the lore. Like I said, I grew up when Bram Stoker was it was geared towards me. It was geared towards my age group at the time, and it was
unfortunately before my time.
Yeah. But yeah, I had posters on the wall. But the thing was, Lucy loved Lucy. Lucy was the main heroine's best friend, and she was being turned into one of the vampire's bride kind of deals. And yeah, she was awesome. Loved the whole thing about the way Bram Stoker was presented was brilliant, and that was what really brought vampire into modern day culture, into the forms that we see it now.
Yeah.
But not Twilight. Twilight doesn't exist.
We're going to have 1,000 screaming fans going, Twilight! I'm going to be like, no. You take your sparkly bullshit vampires and go away.
Look, don't get me wrong. If I had been maybe 10 or 15 years younger when Twilight came out, I might have been all over that shit.
My friend has the best reason to hate Twilight ever, and I 1,000% agree with him.
What's that?
Twilight vampires cannot be killed by the sun. They are basically bulletproof. They are made of marble. Nothing can hurt them. Nothing can kill them. Why have they not dominated human society?
That's actually a really good point.
Yeah, there's literally no reason we're not just cows in that universe. They're like, well, no, we have to protect them, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, why? Like, they can't hurt you. There's no reason to. You just treat them like cows.
A lot of these weaknesses that the vampires had were legitimately so we could defeat them. Because otherwise they were undefeatable, and they would have dominated us and wiped both species out.
Yep. The reason it's called the Masquerade is because they're pretending they don't exist, because there's already been a couple crusades that almost wiped the vampires off the planet. It's actually in the Vampire the Masquerade lore. They're like, yeah, the first crusade was because one vampire hated another vampire country, and they got the paladins involved. The paladins figured out they were vampires and started killing them wholesale.
Mm-hmm.
The second crusade was they did it again, this time with black helicopters.
I think we've milked this topic for all it's worth.
Why is the milk red? Anyway, there's also a fantastic anime series called Hellsing that's about Alucard, the son of Dracula, who works for a agent to kill other vampires, and it is great.
Cool.
I bring this up because earlier you said something about eating people, and there's an abridged version like there is of a lot of anime. And as soon as you said it, my brain went to, bitch, I eat people, which is a line from that. And I was trying very hard not to say it.
Well, see, this, again, it's one of those deviations, one of those deviations on vampire lore, is that some vampires can only consume blood, nothing else. Other vampire laws, they can eat and drink and whatever, but they also need blood to survive. If they don't drink the blood, they will die. I mean, the Buffy vampires were like that.
Yeah,
it was like
Alucard can only drink blood.
Yeah, of course, because Spike was always getting drunk.
Yeah.
He was always drinking. You go into the Anita Blake universe, and the only way a vampire could taste food is through their human servant. Through
Yes.
their like a yeah.
I will go into great lengths discussing with you in private times Vampire the Masquerade and all the interesting things it has like that, if you'd like.
Awesome.
But
One last thing I will leave because I haven't mentioned it, and it is one of the newer TV series and movies that have come out with vampires, and it's called What Shadows. Now, if you want to giggle, have a good look at this series and this movie. What We Do in the Shadows is actually New Zealand. It's been done like a reality TV show, and it's like a bunch of vampires sharing a house.
A house. Yeah. There was also another one recently that was originally British, and then they did an American adaptation that was a vampire, a werewolf, and a ghost all living in a house together. And I forget what the name of it was. But it was actually pretty interesting too. Except it got weird because the vampire fell in love with the ghost. But either way.
Yep.
I think that's all the time we have.
I think we literally, we're out of time, physically out of time.
Yeah, we have like 2.5 minutes left on this recording.
before Anchor says no.
Anchor throws us out a window. And before
No
Anchor
more.
defenestrates us. Which sucks because I was going to get into Innistrad a little bit, but then I forgot, and now we're out of time.
Yeah. We can do that some other time.
So yes, I know about Innistrad. I play Magic. I'm a giant dork. What about it?